Great Pyramid of Khufu here at Giza is the culmination of hundreds of years of trial and error in pyramid building.
The hieroglyphs everyone points to weren't supposed to settle the mystery, yet they've become the center of one. Some inscriptions linked to the pyramids appear controversial, with critics arguing they look newer than the surrounding stone, while others may be workmarks added long after construction. But here's where the story changes. According to research on the Wadi El-Jarf papyri, a 4,500-year-old logbook recorded crews delivering limestone for the Great Pyramid. And if you had a logbook of deliveries to a monument, wouldn't that be stronger evidence than a cartouche inside? But if the cartouche isn't the strongest proof, where do we find the workers' own traces? The hieroglyph claim. At the heart of the pyramid mystery are a few hidden markings inside the Great Pyramid. Many cite these inscriptions as definitive proof that the builders identified themselves, seemingly closing the debate. However, a closer examination reveals that these inscriptions muddy the waters, making the central question more complex. Do these hieroglyphs actually reveal the workforce, or do they mainly showcase royal assertion? Most of the inscriptions people cite fall into two categories. The first are royal cartouches, oval-shaped symbols that enclosed the names of kings. When people talk about the pyramid hieroglyphs, they're usually referring to the cartouche carrying Khufu's name. According to Britannica's overview of Egyptian hieroglyphs, cartouches marked royal names, so finding one inside the Great Pyramid immediately connected the monument to the pharaoh historians believe commissioned it. But the markings that really catch people's attention aren't always the formal royal ones. There are also painted symbols and rough inscriptions in hidden chambers above the king's chamber, which look far more practical. Unlike the ceremonial cartouches, some of these seem like notes left by work crews during the massive construction project. Researchers interpret several as crew names and work gang labels, functioning more as signatures of the builders than indicators of ownership. Distinguishing these from royal cartouches is crucial, and that's where the controversy begins. A claim that circulates widely online argues that certain inscriptions appear newer than the stone surfaces beneath them. For example, in one popular podcast discussion, critics suggest some markings may have been added long after the pyramid was completed. This theory has gained attention because, if true, it would raise obvious questions about authenticity. Here's the thing, though. Despite how often the claim is repeated, researchers promoting the idea have not produced primary excavation records demonstrating that the markings were added in a later period. Thus, while the argument exists, the documentation needed to verify it remains disputed. Meanwhile, mainstream Egyptology treats the cartouches differently. According to standard archaeological interpretations of the Giza pyramids, the presence of Khufu's name identifies royal ownership or association with the monument. It does not automatically mean Khufu personally built it, designed it, or physically directed every stage of construction. A royal name inside a monument tells us who claimed it or commissioned it. That's not necessarily the same thing as identifying the workers who hauled the stone, organized the labor force, or managed daily operations. Think about that for a second. If a cartouche sits inside a chamber, does that prove the pharaoh built it, or just that he claimed it? This distinction between royal identifiers and actual worker signatures is pivotal. If the most cited inscriptions are royal symbols, not true signatures from builders, the accepted story becomes less certain. Understanding what the hieroglyphs really signify changes the entire narrative about who built the pyramids. Because if the cartouche itself is disputed, and if royal names don't automatically identify the workforce, then where do we find evidence that actually names the people behind the construction? The Khufu cartouche controversy. The workers' names and the cartouche are distinct elements. The workers' names aren't hiding inside the cartouche. This immediately stands out when examining the inscription at the center of this entire debate. What people call the Khufu cartouche is a royal name written in hieroglyphs and enclosed within an oval shape, used to identify kings and protect their names in writing. In other words, it's more like a royal label than a construction record. That sounds straightforward until you look at where it was found. Deep in narrow chambers above the king's chamber, explorers found red painted markings, including Khufu's name. For mainstream Egyptologists, this discovery seems to confirm their view. Britannica notes the Great Pyramid is generally attributed to Khufu, the 4th dynasty ruler who reigned around 2600 BC. Finding his name inside appears to support this narrative. Yet, the controversy persists. But the moment you step back from the cartouche itself, the confidence around it starts to wobble a little. Inside those chambers above the king's chamber, you don't see a single clean inscription carved for history. Instead, you encounter painted markings, rough strokes, and names that sit in places most visitors will never even see. Here, the debate really starts to split. Some researchers look at those markings and see simple construction traces, the kind of thing a working team leaves behind while moving thousands of stone blocks through tight spaces. Others argue the position and style don't align neatly with formal royal inscriptions, opening the door to the possibility that what we're seeing might not be a declaration of ownership at all. And then comes the harder question people keep circling back to. If these marks really were tied to Khufu during construction, they still don't explain the full picture of who actually did the work on the ground, stone by stone, year after year. Think about that for a second. Would you trust a name tag found inside a tomb as proof of who built it? After all, ownership and construction aren't necessarily the same thing. A king's name on a monument can show authority, sponsorship, or association. Throughout history, rulers have placed their names on projects they commissioned without personally directing the labor force that carried them out. Some researchers have even asked whether blocks marked with royal names could ever have been reused elsewhere, although no consensus supports that explanation for the Great Pyramid itself. And that's why the cartouche remains such a fascinating piece of evidence. It exists. Nobody disputes that. What people disagree about is what it means. According to recent reporting on worker inscriptions discussed by archaeologists, including Zahi Hawass, evidence increasingly points toward organized teams of skilled laborers rather than anonymous slave armies. Yet those workers are not identified by the famous cartouche itself. So if these inscriptions emphasize royal ownership rather than the individuals performing the labor, where does the evidence naming the actual workers reside? Pinpointing this is essential to answering the real question: who, specifically, built the pyramids? Wadi El-Jarf, the harbor logbook that tracks limestone to the Great Pyramid. The strongest clue to the pyramid mystery wasn't carved in stone, but written on fragile papyrus, hidden for centuries in a forgotten Red Sea harbor at Wadi El-Jarf. Found halfway between Suez and Hurghada and lost to memory for millennia, the site yielded an astonishing discovery when French archaeologist Pierre Tallet and his team began excavations. A functioning ancient harbor system from the 4th dynasty. Reports in Archaeology magazine now identify Wadi El-Jarf as one of the world's oldest known harbors. Yet the real breakthrough came not from the docks or anchor stones, but from the storage caves nearby. Inside sealed limestone galleries, the team found more than 30 papyrus rolls, dated by archaeological analysis to about 2607 to 2605 BCE. These weren't ceremonial texts or royal decrees. They were work records, tracking people, food, and construction materials in detail. And get this, one of the most discussed entries refers to a work gang known as the escort team of the Uraeus of Khufu is its prow, a name that directly links the workforce to the reign of Khufu himself. According to interpretations discussed in Language Hat's analysis of the papyri, these records suggest a structured team of around 160 workers moving materials in coordinated shifts, not scattered laborers, but organized crews with assigned responsibilities. Now here's where it gets interesting. These papyri don't just list names, they track movement. They record limestone deliveries from Tura, transported along canals to major Giza Plateau construction sites. Archaeology magazine's feature on Wadi El-Jarf notes the text's log supply chains of food rations, tools, and labor allocation as a daily operations log for a massive state project. Think about that for a second. If you had a logbook of deliveries to a monument, wouldn't that be stronger proof than a cartouche inside? Because that's exactly what these records feel like. Not symbolism, not a later interpretation, just raw administrative documentation from people who were actually moving stone and feeding crews in real time. Even documentaries like PBS Nova's coverage of the Wadi El-Jarf discovery highlight how unusual it is to find this level of operational detail surviving from the Old Kingdom, especially tied directly to Khufu's building programs. And once you see it like that, the story shifts. The pyramid isn't just a mystery of names carved into stone. It becomes a managed system, with teams, routes, and supply chains stretching across ancient Egypt. So if these workers were organized, recorded, and tracked in such detail, who exactly were they beyond the numbers and the gang names? Workers, not slaves. The idea that the pyramids were built by enslaved labor collapses the moment you step into the worker settlements buried just outside the Giza Plateau. What archaeologists uncovered there doesn't look like a forced labor camp at all. It looks organized, structured, almost like a planned city built specifically to support a massive state project. According to coverage from Britannica's explanation of pyramid construction debates, modern Egyptology increasingly rejects the older slave narrative in favor of paid, seasonal laborers working under state organization. And that shift in interpretation didn't come from speculation. It came from what was found in the ground. Excavations led by teams including Dr. Zahi Hawass have revealed worker villages with bakeries, storage areas, and housing built for rotating crews. According to reporting in Greek City Times, summarizing Hawass's findings, estimates suggest around 10,000 skilled workers were involved in peak construction phases, with crews rotating in and out depending on the season and state needs. Think about what that actually implies. This wasn't a static group of people chained to stone blocks for decades. It was a managed workforce, moving in cycles, fed and housed close to the construction zone. And get this, the evidence for how they were treated is literally in their food supply. Archaeological studies linked to the Wadi El-Jarf papyri show detailed records of rations being distributed to crews, including bread, beer, fish, and other staples necessary to sustain large labor groups. These weren't symbolic offerings. They were logistical records, tracking exactly what workers received to keep the entire system running. Now here's where it gets interesting. If this were a slave system, you'd expect minimal upkeep, survival conditions, and forced extraction. But what the evidence actually shows is something closer to a highly organized workforce supported by state resources. Would slaves get bread, beer, fish, and medical care, or just chains? Even more surprising, studies highlighted in PBS documentaries on the Giza worker settlement describe medical treatment areas where injured workers were cared for, suggesting that keeping laborers healthy was part of the construction strategy itself. That doesn't fit the traditional image of disposable labor. It fits a system that depended on skilled, maintained workers over long periods. And once you connect that back to the logbooks from Wadi El-Jarf, the picture becomes even clearer. Food, tools, and manpower weren't just mentioned casually. They were tracked, recorded, and managed like a national operation. Every worker mattered because every task fed into the next stage of construction. So the pyramid stops looking like a monument built under fear and force. It starts looking like something closer to a national project, coordinated across regions, supported with logistics, and staffed by skilled labor that had to be kept alive, healthy, and organized. But if these weren't slaves, and the pyramids weren't just royal tomb projects in the way people imagine, then what exactly did the ancient Egyptians themselves call these structures when they spoke about them in their own language? What the Egyptians actually called the pyramids. The word pyramid wasn't even in the ancient Egyptian vocabulary, and that alone changes how you think about these monuments. That term comes from Greek writers who later encountered the structures and used the word pyramis, which originally referred to a type of wheat cake because of its triangular shape. According to Britannica's historical overview of the pyramids of Giza, the Greeks were the ones who popularized the label we still use today, long after the Old Kingdom builders were gone. But the Egyptians themselves were doing something very different with language. Instead of one generic name, they used a mix of terms that tied the structures directly to royal identity and cosmic meaning. One of the most common root words was MR, often transliterated as Emir, which appears in ancient inscriptions and scholarly reconstructions as a general term associated with pyramid structures or monumental tomb architecture, as discussed in linguistic analyses of Old Egyptian terminology. And then you get the names that feel almost poetic. According to compilations of pyramid names preserved in ancient Egyptian records and summarized by Egyptological sources such as Ancient Egypt Online, the Great Pyramid wasn't just a structure. It was called something closer to Horizon of Khufu. That name alone shifts the entire frame. It stops being a pile of stone and starts sounding like a symbolic gateway between earth and sky. Other pyramids followed the same pattern. Sneferu's Red Pyramid is associated with expressions often translated as Sneferu rises in splendor, while Menkare's complex carries meanings tied to divinity, often rendered as Menkare is divine. Sahur's pyramid complex is similarly described in texts as the place where his soul rises, reinforcing the idea that these were not just burial sites, but carefully named spiritual monuments tied to royal transformation. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Some linguistic interpretations, including discussions in older transliteration debates, suggest a term like kuti, sometimes translated as the lights, pointing toward a solar or horizon-based interpretation of pyramid complexes. While not universally accepted in mainstream Egyptology, it reflects how ancient naming systems often leaned toward cosmic symbolism rather than simple architectural labels. Think about that for a second. If you built a monument meant to last for eternity, would you really call it a pyramid, or would you name it something closer to Horizon of Khufu? That shift in naming changes how you see everything we've discussed so far. These weren't just stacked stones or anonymous royal tombs. The language around them suggests identity, transition, and cosmic role, not just construction. And once you see that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the names point to meaning and the cartouches point to ownership, then who actually did the building on the ground? Day after day, stone after stone. The verdict. The moment you line everything up side by side, the entire debate about hieroglyphs revealing the pyramid builders starts to split in two completely different directions. On one side, you've got the cartouche argument. A royal name inside a monument, most famously Khufu, is used by mainstream Egyptology as evidence of association with the Great Pyramid. According to Britannica's historical overview of the pyramids of Giza, Khufu is the 4th dynasty ruler traditionally credited with commissioning its construction, and royal inscriptions like cartouches are generally understood as markers of authority and ownership, rather than detailed labor records. On the other side, you've got something far more grounded. The Wadi El-Jarf papyri don't talk in symbols or royal names carved into stone. They talk in logistics. According to Archaeology magazine's coverage of the excavation, these documents record shipments, crews, and coordinated movement of limestone tied to Khufu's building projects, dated to around 2607 to 2605 BCE. That's not interpretation layered on top of stone. That's administration written at the time the system was running. And once you bring in the worker city near Giza, described in PBS documentaries and archaeological reports, the picture becomes even sharper. Skilled laborers, bakeries, medical care, ration systems, all pointing to an organized workforce operating under state control, not anonymous laborers lost to history. According to summaries of Zahi Hawas's excavations reported in Greek City Times, estimates place around 10,000 skilled workers cycling through the site during peak construction phases. So you end up with two very different types of evidence. One is symbolic, a cartouche inside a monument. The other is operational, a living system of workers, food, tools, and delivery records moving in real time. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The popular claim that hieroglyphs reveal who built the pyramids often leans heavily on interpretations of inscriptions without primary excavation context. Even discussions of so-called newer hieroglyphs seen in online commentary remain theories without direct supporting excavation records confirming later additions or reinterpretations. So, what actually holds up when you strip everything else away? Think about it for a second. If you had to choose between one cartouche inside a chamber or a full logbook tracking deliveries, crews, and materials moving toward the Giza Plateau, which one actually proves who built it? That's the tension at the center of this entire story. Names versus records, symbol versus system. And when you follow the evidence instead of the mythology, the conclusion becomes surprisingly consistent. The pyramids weren't built by slaves, and they weren't explained by isolated inscriptions. They were built by skilled Egyptian workers, organized through state logistics, and remembered through names that described something far bigger than just stone structures. Horizon of Khufu, Mr., and Kuti all point to monuments designed as royal solar expressions, not simple tomb labels. The final truth is less mysterious than people expect, but more complex than the viral claim suggests. The hieroglyph story doesn't collapse the mystery. It just shifts it away from symbols carved in stone and toward the people and systems that actually made the pyramids possible. And once you see it that way, one question still lingers. What part of this story surprised you the most? Ancient hieroglyphs reveal who built pyramids. What shocked you most? Cartouche, logbook, or name? Leave a comment on your thoughts down below.